my camera this morning because I just woke up not too long ago. So I'm not going to turn that on. And I apologize if any of my little people come running in here um, uh, because they're very likely to do so, even though I told them to stay in their room. Um, all right, so I'm going to talk this morning about Chopin. Um, Hopefully, you've gotten to read the work and everything, or this could be your day that you work on classwork, so you hadn't quite gotten to it. Um, Either way, I think this will provide you a good overview of Chopin. Uh, I said this in my last meeting, and excuse the cough. I'm still trying to get over this pneumonia stuff. Chopin is one of my favorite authors, primarily because um, she is a feminist, and that's not why I like her, but she was a writer way before her time, and her work during her lifetime never received the critical acclaim and achievement that it has now, since she has passed years ago, and it is, her work is some of the most read and discussed, not just as a feminist piece, but also as a reflection of historical accuracy, or caption of feelings historically of women during her time. And so we see that in her stories, and it's very easy to, some students really struggle with Chopin. They just can't like her. Um, they don't think her work is um, becoming of a woman, or whatnot, and that's certainly fine. Those kind of ideals usually come from like deep ingrained beliefs and so forth. But what I like to encourage readers with Chopin is to realize that her writing is really her trying to express what women had to go through in the 1890s, and what their struggles were, and their places were in society. You have to remember, this is a time period in America where women were defined by who they married. This is also a time where we still had a very strong ingrained kind of hierarchical social um, crust, if you will, very much European, and to where you only married into your own class system. And among the wealthy, you had a lot of people marrying solely to maintain money and lineage, and um, those sort of things, not marrying for love at all. And so you have that issue, excuse me, very much dominating the lives of women. This is also not a period where, women were educated, or that they had their own jobs, or they were, this kind of I can do what I want sort of um, thing as we have now. I say every semester I tell my students, we're raised in the Beyonce, all the single ladies, empowerment um, uh, time period, where we're taught to stand up for ourselves. And even so, now in 2017, 2018, we see this strong feminist push, right? The strong equality for women, and so forth. But you have to remember, we're in the 1890s with Chopin, and that is not at all what she was experiencing. The other thing that Chopin tackles are these kind of um, sexual feelings that um, demonstrating that women have, that would not at all in the 1890s have been appropriate to express, right? And again, it's difficult for us in our culture to understand, because women dressing provocatively and acting sexy, and saying what they want sexually is not shocking, right? We are the generation who is watching 50 Shades of Grey and embracing it. Um, so we're definitely not who Chopin was originally dealing with. So when her writing reflected these deep sexual tones, critics really slammed her. because it was just seen as so inappropriate for a woman. So keep that in mind, as you consider Chopin, that a lot of this is not this kind of reflection of um, trying to be this wild, kind of loose woman, but it's a reflection of her trying to express all the feelings of a woman that have been suppressed. Her most famous novel is The Awakening, and I highly suggest you read it if you get a chance. Again, this was seen to be incredibly scandalous um, work of art. It's about a wealthy woman who falls in love with, the help and has an affair, essentially. But there are lots of other layers that go into that. Um, and it's a pretty clean novel, I would say. Now, early critics would say, wow, this is really scandalous, very pornographic. Um, and it's just, again, it's funny to me. I don't know if y'all have read Fifty Shades of Grey, but I did. I took that plunge because I wanted to see what everyone was so interested about. Um, and you talk about, scandalous. There's a scandalous novel, right? The Awakening is nothing like that. It is more an exploration of feelings and desires. And again, this is Chopin trying to express that ideal. And just one little thing else about Chopin as far as her biography. She had several kids, married to a husband who passed away when her kids were young, and left her with a lot of debt. And so she went from somebody who was doing pretty good in society, who seemed to have money and position and a business, to somebody who finds out once her husband dies, she has nothing. And she really struggled with depression at that time because, again, what was a woman to do, right? She didn't have the means to work, and certainly wasn't socially acceptable to work. She couldn't do the things her husband was doing, and then to find out that her husband left him in debt without any money, put her in a very tragic position. And a physician suggested to her that she write and express these ideas, which is a very interesting kind of thought to keep with you as we read next week the Yellow Wallpaper Gilman story, because there's some parallels there in that kind of um, mental health aspect of females. Um, but the doctor expressed, told her to write, and this is kind of the result is she had this literary career, and again, never appreciated, never acclaimed. She dealt with a lot of issues after publishing her work. The Awakening was immediately banned and not allowed to be read, burned many copies. So what was her cathartic outlet ended up also being a great inner turmoil. So it's a kind of tragic side of recognizing who Chopin is as a writer and what she went through. All right, so looking at the story of an hour, this is one of my favorite stories because it's so brief and it says so much. And I show students this story because this really captures who Chopin is. Um, she is a writer who is a real master of economy. And that means she tries to say as much as she can in as few words as she can. So when you just look at the story of an hour, you think, oh, well, how can there be that many details? How can it be that rich of a story? It's so brief. Um, but she uses a lot of symbolism to give you a much deeper meaning into the story. And a typical kind of reaction to the story from students is, God, she is horrible. Her husband is dead, and this is how she reacts. She seems excited, and it's all about her. But again, you have to remember this is a reflection of Chopin trying to express to readers what it's like to be a woman in the 1890s when you do not marry for love, when you're in a higher social class. Um, Here, it's obvious the husband was older, which is very typical of this period where older men would marry younger women. Um, and so she's showing this kind of reaction of, she's essentially her husband's property. And so the realization that the only way in which a woman at this time period could really live on their own, make their own choices, is if they were a widow left with money. And if they had that ability, then they could have this freedom. And so that's really what has happened here is this wealthy woman has realized that her husband has passed, and she's realizing the freedom that she's going to get from it, and she becomes elated over it. Um, and so when you look at the story, it's like, well, how did you know she was wealthy? Well, there's a lot of details in here that she's wealthy. During this time period, a woman who was not wealthy would have been very panicked over money because her whole life would have been essentially destroyed by the one person who made money leaving. So that's a big detail in here is that she doesn't have any panics about money, and the time that she thinks about her life ahead is full of this kind of freedom and happiness and so forth. And so very good indicator that she she is a woman of wealth. The other thing is, you know, the one misconception that students come away with this is that she was sitting there waiting for him to die. And there are lots of details in here that she was not sitting waiting for him to die. As you know, matter of fact, she had never even considered this as an option, had never really realized that this, pattern of events, what it could do for her. And that's important when you're looking at the character, right? And then I have a lot of students who say, well, he must have been horrible. He must have been a horrible man for her to be so happy of his death. No, there are lots of details that show that he was a good guy, that he actually loved her. But it doesn't matter if he loved her when there's this kind of relationship of power, right? That he chose her to marry him, that he owns her, that he controls her financially, and that's all a social system that's set up in the time period. And so, really, when you leave the story and you look at the characters, Chopin isn't really wanting you to find a who's right and who's wrong in the story. She's wanting you to consider the time period, right? She wants you to really think over what women were bound to and understand that struggle. All right, so looking at the very beginning, we begin with a heart comment and we end with a heart comment. The first line says, knowing that Miss Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So we have two different troubles here, two different heart problems. One, the idea of love, right, that we commonly think is the problem of the heart. The other is actually that she had some kind of physical ailment with her heart. So we begin the story like that, and we end the story. The last line says, when the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. And so we see again that use of the heart. Um, but also, how does a joy kill, right? And so you have a couple different paradoxes in this story, which are logical contradictions. But the heart problem here that she's afflicted with is she had so much hope, right? And that hope is immediately dashed. And that is when you realize your life can be something totally different, and you have that aha moment, if you will, and then all of a sudden you realize it can't, that it's not going to be what you thought, right? It's that deafening sadness that she has. And so, understandably, we think that she probably died of a heart attack, but it's also from a deep grievance. Uh, Understanding her husband is back. Um, so okay, so let me just touch on a couple of parts in the story. Um, so on the third paragraph, it says she did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. And this is a very important detail. When Chopin says she heard it as not like many women would hear it, that is your detail of that she's got wealth and she doesn't love him. Because women who didn't have wealth, as I mentioned, would hear it a different way, and also a woman who loved her husband would hear it a different way, right? That would be totally different impact. But also that detail, paralyzed inability to accept its significance, is important because, as I said, Miss Mallard is not a bad character. She was not waiting for this. She comes to the conclusion of what this means to her later. Um, all right, so lots of details in here. The armchair near the window is a detail of somebody that's symbolic of somebody who watches life but doesn't participate in life. Um, but skipping down even more so, it says that she sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. And this is an important detail because the emotions she's feeling have been personified here, and that is because she's going through this grief, and Chopin really wants you to understand as a reader that she didn't expect any of this. She didn't want any of this, and she didn't relish in his death at all. And that's important to her overall character development. And the next line says she was young with a fair, calm face whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed off yonder on those patches of blue skies. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. So that's important. We get a detail that she's young in there, right? And that underneath all of this repression, that there is this certain kind of inner female strength. Um, but the writer has already told us that she's looking out at the sky that has all this gray sky with little patches of blue, and the narrator, I mean, Miss Mallard, is looking out at that, and she's focused on the blue ones, right? The idea of the positivity in the future, and it says it's not a glance of reflection. So when you think about when a loved one dies, what do? We go back to the very beginning of the relationship, right? And we relive all of those wonderful moments and wonderful times. That's not what she's doing here. Um, she's having what the writer calls as an indicated a suspension of intelligent thought, right? It's starting to click to her what this means. Um, and the next line is critical. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? And that's important, right? She was fearfully waiting for it. She wasn't excitedly waiting for it. She did not know, it was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air, right? And so this is when this kind of idea of the freedom that she's going to get from her husband comes through her, right? And she starts to think about all the life that she lives, it will come to live, and says, what did it say? Just trying to find a line. Um, and she basically says that she starts to whisper free, so she realizes that, and tells us that yesterday she had wished her life would not be that long, and today she's wishing that it will last a long time, right? This incredibly quick moment of change throughout her. But then we get into excuse me, kind of the bulk of what Chopin's trying to say to us is the moral of the story, I guess. Should there be no one to live for during those coming years, she would live for herself, right? And that, as sad as that sounds, it's a positive here. The idea that there would be nobody else to live for, but just herself, because she hasn't gotten to do that, right? She's essentially been kind of enslaved to this husband. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence of which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. Right? And so this is Chopin saying it doesn't matter how good the person is that is being married into an arranged marriage, or how wonderful the husband is. No matter what, these relationships during this time period are these kind of imprisonments in which women have no real power and no real freedom, and the men have it all. And that is her point, right? Um, of the whole story when you get to it. But I want to go back up um, 2 lines where it says it describes her husband, and this is really the only real description we get of him. She says she's thinking of him in the casket, right? And she says she was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her. She was striving to beat it back with her will. And that's an important detail because, again, she didn't want to feel this happiness with this realization of what was coming to her. And it always makes me think of, whenever you're doing something and a thought comes in your head and you're like, oh, why did I think that? Where did that come from? Would never want to think that. That's kind of what she's going through here, right? Okay. As powerless as her 2 white slender hands would have been, But that's not the line that I was looking for. Hold on. Uh, well, okay. For some reason, I cannot see it. I can't seem to find it. But when it describes him in his casket, um, basically is it says that that he had kind, tender hands, which is very important. Chopin removing the aspect of any type of abuse or evilness. But the other thing is it says later on that he never looked at her except with love, and that's very important because he actually is in love with her, and so that kind of dashes any of those thoughts um, that he was at all abusive or anything. All right, so this is a very quick analysis of the story of an hour. I usually spend an hour and a half going through each detail because it is so important. All of the little crafting that Chopin has done. While this seems like a very small story, very easy read, it's just loaded with symbolism and meaning and real analysis that needs to take place in this story. And so some of the people who read the story, my students, initially are like, gosh, she is horrible. Well, you missed them. That's a good initial response, right? But go back and look what Chopin is really talking about here, and the time period, and really consider the historical aspect of women, and what this kind of feminist movement was that Chopin was looking for, right? It was just the basic freedom to make choices, to handle your own money, to live for yourself. All of that, which women did not have at that time period. They had to latch themselves to a man in order to survive. The next story you read this week is The Storm, and I'll just kind of briefly touch on this. I won't say too much. The Storm is fun. I mean, I've always enjoyed The Storm. I enjoy students' reactions because typically, my very conservative students are completely appalled by the story, and just think that Calixta is absolutely horrible, and can't see past anything of that. But The Storm is a sequel or a prequel, or no, it's a sequel to a story called At the Cadian Ball. Um, and so you can read The Storm without reading At the Cadian Ball and completely understand it just fine. If you read At the Cadian Ball, it just kind of adds a level of richness to the story. Um, but this is essentially, a story of a storm comes in, right, and causes a sequence of events where Calixta's husband can't make it home in time. Her long lost love just happens to be passing by on a horse, and they have a sexual encounter. And then the storm passes, and he leaves, and everything goes back to normal, right? And she, and again, this is that story of this kind of feminist perspective of females, just like males, right, have these kind of sexual desires and longings for things, and society certainly doesn't think that's appropriate at all. Um, but also that feeling of, did Calixta marry the right person? Um, again, why did she marry her husband, and so forth? And a lot of people are bothered at the end where she doesn't tell her husband about what happened, and everything seems to just going to go on like normal. And so, what does that say about the morals of Chopin? And I would again, venture to say, don't look at it in such a kind of religious moral light. Look at it again in this kind of feminist perspective of the 1890s, and what women's roles were and what they went through. Because this was certainly behavior acceptable from a man, but from a woman, it's very different. And the other thing I'll mention here, just remind me, Chopin quite often writes in the Creole language, using a lot of that Creole heritage and focus. You know, she lived in Louisiana, and so she has a lot of that French kind of Louisiana influence in her writing. So we see a lot of that in the names and in the writing and some of the language that she uses, especially in The Storm. Not so much in The Story of the Hour. But all right, so I won't go too much more on The Storm. So I think we're right at the 30-minute mark. Yep. So I hope that gives you kind of a little better understanding of these two stories. You know, I highly encourage, you know, if you at all like them, to really kind of think about, um, you know, they're both great research paper topics. Um, you know, because there's so much that can be done here as far as a feminist reading, historical perspective, character analysis, plot development, use of economy and writing, um, and just maybe a reflection of authorial intent, right? Uh, where do we see Chopin herself reflected in this writing? Um, but also, you know, also the perspective of how horrible society thought these literature was pieces of work were, but now how greatly they lend themselves to an understanding of American um, values or ideals or perspectives from a woman in the 1890s. All right. Any questions, comments? If not, you guys are free to go. Thanks so much for joining me so early. Um, I'll send out a recording of this, and then I'll also do another Collaborate this week. I'm going to send out an announcement just a little bit asking for um, times that for those who have not met their 2 requirement yet, certain times that work best for them, and then I'll send out next week's Collaborate session. Y'all have a great Sunday. I hope you have some time to relax. Thank you.